Good afternoon to you all, or good morning, or good evening to you, wherever you may be today. Coming up next is Jaspal Sawhney from Tata Communications, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce him to you. Jaspal is the Chief Information Security Officer for Tata Communications, heading their Global Information Security Group, holding responsibility for Information Security Charter and cybersecurity strategy for the firm. Jaspal brings with him a rich global experience within cybersecurity, information risk and technology leadership roles for close to 28 years, both inside of Tata Communications and in the financial world. Prior to Tata Communications, Jaspal was with Deutsche Bank in India and Singapore, holding various roles such as the CISO for the Deutsche Bank franchise in India, including the organizational leadership for the CISO services organization. He's held senior leadership roles in cybersecurity and has managed large global security services organizations, regulatory programs, and the design and implementation of multi-year strategic information security initiatives. It gives me great pleasure today to introduce him to you, and Jaspal will be talking about the challenges of the CISO role, but also give you great insight to the varied role of the Chief Information Security Officer, and also the friendly CISO. Jaspal, good afternoon to you.
Good morning, afternoon, evening, depending where you are. Am I audible, Paul? Everyone?
Yes, you are, Jaspal. You can be seen and heard loud and clear, my friend.
Thank you very much, and thanks for that very generous introduction. There's a good chance that everyone who's on the session has somehow been associated with solving cybersecurity, information security problems for wherever they are. And I try to keep this narrative very simple, easy to comprehend, hopefully, and basically talk a little bit about how the role of CISO came in play. What does it mean in doing it together, and what are the challenges in front of a CISO? Not just CISO, but honestly, any large enterprise which considers cyber as a mainstream business risk. So I just tried to jot down few thoughts in nothing more than 3 slides. And I hope at some point in the discussion, we have more interaction in the session. So with that, I start. Is that okay, Paul?
Absolutely. You go ahead, Jaspal.
Okay.
And yes, to the audience, please feel free to ask any questions that as Jaspal takes you through.
Okay, I will start. So like I said, I broke this down into 3 parts. Why CISO happened, and there's a reason I'm using this term. CISO Inc., In It Together, and CISO The New Frontiers. So let's start. So why CISO happened? IT and IT security were always there, but we know makers can't be checkers. Also, security was never a mainstream profession. I think this all started roughly about 95, 96, 97. This also was a precursor to the dot-com boom when there was more digitization. And I think naturally some of these things begin to come in place together. Most security professionals, they evolved from earlier networks or firewall admin roles. Could be strong system admins as well. But then something happened, right? We had more of digital agendas of the large enterprises taken on internet. There was real money, and there was real risk and more sort of financials at stake. In the meanwhile, the threat actors got funded and cyber attacks became real. And this was no longer just a discussion on one internet worm which disrupted the internet traffic for, as a one-off incident. So if we start looking at 2011 onwards, attack on Sony personal data of 77 million users, 2014, again, Sony Pictures, 100 terabyte of data stolen. Targeted, the largest retail outfit, got breached. Banking data of 40 million customers. Equifax disclosed PII of 143 million customers, 200K card details. Whether it is Marriott Hotels, Yahoo, or any other large critical infrastructure, in sort of different state nations. And then we had series of malware, ransomware, whether it is WannaCry, Petya, NoPetya, 2016, 2017, and the journey continues. So attack on critical infrastructure, corporate espionage, large-scale ransomware, cyber warfare, data breaches, and the works. So what do we see here? The motivations are very varied, and there is more sophistication and more advancement at the hands of threat actors. Regulations help. When there were attacks, the respective ministries, the respective regulators came into rescue. They came up with comprehensive cybersecurity frameworks. They also defined role of a CISO. They also mandated CISO as a mandatory role, as a senior role in most large critical infrastructure institutions. But was CISO still a life insurance? Yes, it's good to have one, but could you only rely on that? So this is a little backdrop. Let's go further. CISO Inc. In it together. What does it mean? So key success factors, as it is true for any influence roles, more so for a CISO role, people, and people. Influence, what does it mean? Your only chance to succeed. Where are your Avengers? Could you just build the resource pool within your own organization, in the CISO organization? Or does it help to have a more segregated, more distributed pool of experts aligned to respective businesses, aligned to various IT units? The answer is the latter. The more partners you have, the more people to watch out security embedded closely within the businesses, the chances for you to have the right level of penetration for your cybersecurity strategy is higher. Cybersecurity is still a niche skill, and maybe it would be so another 10 years. Mind of an analyst, hiring is a challenge, retaining one is an even bigger one. Captive security organizations are often not large enough to provide a wholesome career path to real aspiring experts. So you got to bring in the right mix of captive organization to oversee and to provide continuity. But from an execution standpoint, you may want to consider having the right security partners who bring in the right scale and capability and expertise to execute what's been called out as the charter in that particular discipline of information security. First line of defense or second line of defense, the right balance. Again, it's important for CISO not to completely own the operations. There are parts of security operations which would need to sit as first line within the CISO organization, whether it is a security operations center itself, whether it is security assurance and testing. But there are also functions where CISO needs to maintain an arm's length and provide a second line governance, leaving the execution and implementation with the respective technology units. So what are we saying? Only empowering CISO and is solving half the problem. What does it mean? We have seen with every time there is a big attack, there is a big event in the industry, it's likely that the CISO organization is able to place in the forefront a certain facet of the strategy which needs to be progressively solved over a period of time. Budgets are a challenge, but usually if it's presented and articulated well, the security organizations do find some pockets of money. But that's not enough, because having enough money to define the strategy and to have governance will only solve the problems to a certain point. The important question does business is business really involved more thoroughly in identification, prioritization, and mitigation of cyber risk? Cyber has now, for many years, been recognized as a mainstream business risk, whether it is World Economic Forum reports or whether it is any other publications. Cyber is now being recognized as a mainstream business risk. So it's important that alongside other operational risks, the business units see the need to place cyber actively in the forefront of their discussions on mitigating, um, like all other forms of risk. So, the right execution capability, the right prioritization and management capability within the businesses or the IT teams which are supporting the businesses is as important as enabling the CISO unit itself is. More awareness and more drills. Could there be anything like that? Maybe not. Every day we see, new level of complexity and more advancement in the cyber attacks. What came up as the Pearl Harbor of American IT, or the supply chain, the software supply chain attacks through SolarWinds just being one of the component. I mean, nobody could have precedented or imagined something as sustained and as widespread as that. So, preparing not just to prevent, but also to recover and restore. What does it mean? It's easier said than done, but having comprehensive playbooks involving various BUs, various divisions, right up to the top of the management as needed when there is a real attack, whether it's facing off with the shareholders, whether it's facing off with difficult customers, whether it is internal management from a people perspective, or, of course, as most would imagine, an apt and sort of quick response from a technology perspective. It needs to be a comprehensive strategy, and these drills need to be enacted often and enough, involving the right functions within the organization. I now come to my last line of thought on CISO, the new frontiers. What does it mean, and how, in the changing environment, the CISOs need to continually look at uh, how they tackle uh, the rising sort of menace of ransomware, which has been called often as the greatest cyber risk, or cyber, which itself is uh, presenting itself to be uh, a key sort of business enabler. Um, so whether it is 5G, whether it is IoT, whether it is IoE, what does it mean? More connected devices. I briefly heard in the previous session, the speakers were talking about more regulations, more enablement, more standardization, and the implications of not having this. Combine this with more of edge computing. This only means that the cyber threat surface has been widened much more than ever before. So understanding what to protect becomes even more difficult. And in limited budgets and limited manpower, uh, expecting the same level of controls across the whole stack of enterprise compute is not feasible and not realistic. So, pandemic pressures, more digitization, moving from low touch to no touch business transformation. Um, has there been enough room kept for security? Yes, it's needed to fast track these digitization programs. There is more money set aside on the technical architecture, the transformations, um, and creating these conduits of doing business in the new normal. But it has to be done in a way that it's secure from the beginning, security by design. We all have spoken and heard often of this, but this is the time to really put this principle in play as we bring in more onto digital channels. Enterprise IT, standardization, business aligned IT, more business pressures, more business aligned objectives, more of SaaS, more of PaaS, more cloud acceleration. So where are your crown jewels? Are we in control? Do we know what are we protecting? Like I said in my first point on this slide, it's very important to identify what are the key sort of assets, and do we have the right risk classification, and is our information security strategy protecting those assets commensurating with the risk classification attached to those assets. There were times in the last year when we had 3 10-rated CVEs in a week. For those who were managing the security and the IT estate, they would understand what kind of a havoc this created. And to add to the woes, more prototypes of these exploits were being released in the World Wide Web. The story of asset registers is not unknown to most who are in any kind of management roles, whether it's technology or it's security. So, are we fast enough to patch? I think this is not an easy one to answer, but remains an important and a very pertinent one nonetheless, as you see more and more exploits getting published and more of these exploits getting actually used to create large scale coordinated global cyber attacks. We spoke briefly about unprecedented software supply chain attacks. So your code is your problem. Yes, we knew about it and we did a lot of things to secure the code. Now others' code is also your problem. What does it mean and how do you bring in a greater visibility and control on code which is used to connect to your systems, your IT estate, and what kind of disruption could it cause? We all saw it when SolarWinds episode was unfolding. More attacks on critical infrastructure, whether it is telecom, networks, financial, or gas pipelines, or what you have. So cyber breaches may impact your enterprise even if you are not the target. So what does it mean? Having a more comprehensive business continuity plan, not just taking into account cyber as your own disaster recovery scenarios, but also being prepared for cyber as a business continuity scenario when the critical infrastructure which you are dependent upon is getting breached and attacked. With that, I will take a pause. These were some of the thoughts I had from the start of where the CISO role was created, how it evolved, and what lies in front of us. Very happy to take questions or more suggestions or learn more from experiences as many of you would have had in your respective roles.
No, absolutely. Thank you very much indeed for that, Jaspal. I just want to pick up on, you mentioned there just at the end about business continuity. And in the analyst session this morning by Maxine Holt from Mondia, one of the things that was mentioned was clearly from the perspective of cybersecurity attacks. To date, those attacks have very much been individually focused, whether it's been towards, for instance, a gas pipeline or critical national infrastructure or a bank as an example. What hasn't been seen to date is those attacks all be coordinated at the same time. What are your views on business continuity from the perspective of working within, for instance, the telecommunications world in comparison to your experiences within the financial services world? Because I think one thing that is quite evident is there's often learnings that one industry can take from another.
Yes, I think you picked the right sort of parallels, if I may say, Paul. Financial industry has always been at the front running of more regulations, more directives, more definitions of what's considered as a minimum acceptable, and there are huge financial penalties for not complying with those. Telecom also is heavily telecom. I'm sorry. Am I audible?
No. Yes. Absolutely.
Hello.
No, I can hear you, Jaspal.
And telecom, of course, is also heavily regulated. But I think none of us would have been wiser seeing what we saw in the last 14 to 15 months. And while all of us prepared for some of these scenarios to enact in sequence or in isolation, none of us would have thought, and none of us planned for, even in the banks, planned for a disaster scenario playing beyond 2 weeks or 3 weeks in succession. So I think what we saw and what we prepared and how we navigated and maneuvered our way around, a lot of times, to be very honest, building the airplane as we were flying it, like we say, I think we all would emerge much stronger and wiser now for the times to come and expect the worst, not just seeing one scenario after the other, but actually seeing many of them playing out together in the way when we would have not thought or expected it to be like that. So I think that's where we are. We all have in our respective industries found creative ways to deal with, whether it's people dependencies, whether it's supply chain dependencies, whether it's semiconductor dependencies, or whether it is a never-ending series of mounting cyber attacks which could bring business disruptions on top of all these other pandemic influenced continuity scenarios. I think we have seen almost all what we could. I imagine so.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And obviously in the lead up to this, when you and I first spoke about this event, obviously I highlighted to you the threat vectors as defined here in the UK for telecoms by the National Cybersecurity Centre for supply chain signaling, network and cloud and software and virtualization. And one of the things that you picked up on immediately was the supply chain, the governance and regulation. And the privileged position that you yourself have been had at Tata from the perspective of interactions, for instance, with the government. One of the things that I noted recently from a cybersecurity report from Accenture in 2020 was effectively from the attacks that were taking place, that 60% of them were direct and 40% of them were indirect. What's your policy? How do you see the importance of the policy and process around supply chain management? Because clearly that itself could be seen as a significant and weakest link.
You're very right, and I think supply chain risks have always been called out as right at the top. From the days I was also interfacing with the financial regulators in my earlier role at Deutsche Bank. And one parallel, if I may pick again, between the telecom industry and the financial sort of regulations, what we see, and I refer again specifically in the context of telecom is the new national security directives which have been rolled out in the last couple of months, both in Americas, in UK, in India, and maybe in some other large digital economies. While there is a view and while there is a sort of perspective being created around what's considered as a regulated set of assets or regulated set of entities, the bigger risk always lies in those entities which have been outside the scope of the regulatory regime. So if I have to take an example, in case of telecom, the core networks and what's permitted now in most of these national security directives and what's not being permitted, I think we all know that. But if you see any standard enterprise 5G implementation, besides and beyond the core telecom equipment, there is a lot of enterprise IT which goes to make it work. And that necessarily does not come into the purview of what's being regulated through these national security directives. Yes, there may be other control elements, whether internal to the enterprises, or externally by regulatory frameworks. But what I'm trying to bring, and likewise, if I were to extend the example to the financial space, a lot of payment services companies were always historically outside the scope of the banking regulators, but they could by the very virtue of the fact that they were not enforced to follow certain standards, whether it is Windows 7 ATM machines and what happened in WannaCry. I think this is a great example where the whole supply chain is as strong as the weakest link, as we see.
Absolutely. And coming to the end of the session now, obviously you mentioned cloud before, and you just mentioned standards as well. Talking with a particular organization, messaging aggregator recently, for instance. They're much more than that. They're fully fledged CPaaS, but clearly one of the things that they've been looking at is their kind of endpoint protection response systems. In fact, I know that they implemented a new solution recently to protect themselves from obviously from some of the rising threats in the malware world, but also from the perspective of their approach to kind of governance and security. They've also looked at their processes and baking standards into the development chain. When you look, for instance, at the world that we live in and the cloud environment, say, for instance, AWS, and this question's come from Fadil Dahodwala. He was asking, about how to ensure security, for instance, in the AWS cloud for the likes of, WhatsApp for Business services. What's your kind of view on that from the perspective of the position of, say, Tata Communications?
Yeah, I think it's two important things there. One is identifying what's hosted where and what to protect, like I was briefly touching in my slides earlier, because not everything can be secured to the same extent. So identifying your crown jewels, distributed cloud-first world makes it even more interesting and more complex. That's the first part of it. The second part of it, of course, also is the very nature of cloud services arrangements bring in more than one party. Sometimes, the ISPs, the ASPs, and the cloud service providers, and the hosting firms, and of course the principal organization themselves. And often in the large attacks, it's been seen that things have been breached because they fell in between the cracks. The ball fell in between the courts, and there wasn't enough clarity on who's supposed to do what. And the ASP believes that the hosting firm would do it, and the customer believes somebody else will do it. And in the end, maintaining the right cloud security posture assessment as a basic requirement on an ongoing basis, whether it's a CIS benchmark and reviewing, you got a strong and robust security processes as you would have prior to production release for these cloud environments is absolutely vital. But it's a little bit more involved, intricate, and complex to implement and enforce these with more parties getting involved and more stakeholders coming into play.
Absolutely. Well, Jaspal, we have come to the end of our time today, and it's been a great pleasure to have you join us. And thank you again for your participation and the support of Tata Communications. It really has been very much appreciated, and I look forward to speaking to you again shortly. So yes, a very big thank you on behalf of the Mobile Ecosystem Forum.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks for having me here, and it was great speaking on this platform. You have a good day and all the best for the rest of the session. Thank you.
A pleasure. Thank you very much, Jaspal, and I hope the monsoon rains ease shortly for you there in Mumbai.
They would. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.